In the third drawer of an old walnut desk, behind a ledger of guest names that never existed, a single envelope had been left unstamped, unsealed, and addressed only to the next who enters. Inside a torn page from a train schedule, its edges frayed its ink, marked in a hand too careful to be rushed. No station listed. No time of departure. Only one faint line written in pencil, soft as ash. You are not the first to read this, but you may be the last. The building had no access to rail lines. The names in the guest book had already been buried in bank drafts and silence. And yet, when city records were quietly reviewed, a lease dated just 2 days later surfaced signed Eastef. The ink had not yet dried. If you're reading this now, tell me what country are you in and what time is it there? There's a strange comfort in knowing we are not alone in this hour, scattered across borders and minutes. Each of us pausing right now at the threshold of a room that signed its own lease. This is a record that has never been closed. Like this video, subscribe to the 7th Mark. You're listening to Sleepy History Tales, and this is the story of the apartment for gentlemen only. They kept the letter in a locked drawer for nearly 8 years, folded once, then again with a tenderness that outlasted time. The paper had browned slightly at its creases, but the ink somehow remained unblurred. No smears, no tears. Only a faint scent of violet clinging to the page, impossibly preserved despite age, air, and cedar oil. The envelope had been addressed in a refined and unfamiliar hand to Miss Clara, East Boston. The postman never opened it. A black-inked stamp in the corner revealed its fate, plainly returned unpaid. Inside, Clara East would later recall, was a letter from her brother Franklin, written in a tone more steady than she had ever known. The tone of a man who had quietly let go of something. Franklin East, a silk merchant by trade, made a modest but reliable living, selling imported bolts and hand-stitched gloves to the city's wealthiest ladies. He had never married. His business ledgers were precise. His letters up until the autumn of 1871 were clockwork, brief, factual, and unfailingly punctual. One every 2 weeks, always signed F. East, always printed on the same embossed stationery with the family's phoenix crest. But this letter had been different. The language flowed strangely, almost lyrical. He mentioned almost in passing a weariness with travel, the superficiality of small-town buyers, and most curious of all, a place within the city where, as he wrote, I feel seen, not measured. One line near the end lingered in Clara's mind for years. I've found the place where I'll be understood. Tell no one, Clara, only that I am finally myself. There was no return address. 2 weeks later, a small crate arrived at the family's doorstep, marked only with Franklin's initials. Inside 3 tailored suits, a shaving kit, and a pocket ledger. The suits had been recently pressed. The ledger bore one curious detail. The last week's entries had been filled in by a different hand. But Franklin East was not among the items returned. Railway clerks at Grand Central and Jersey City were questioned. None had issued a ticket in his name. Hotel ledgers across Manhattan were checked by hand. No one remembered him. The delivery slip bore no sender's name, only a stamp from a local parcel service. Its manifest for that date had reportedly been lost. in what was later deemed a clerical fire. When asked, Clara East maintained that her brother was not a man of whims. He was orderly precise. He would never have sent his belongings without a note or at the very least, a follow-up letter. And when asked again about the letter's tone, she hesitated. She didn't recognize the handwriting. There were other discrepancies, subtle but telling. The letter had been signed Franklin, not F. East. The ink bled faintly through the paper, unlike the brand he always used. And though the envelope had been sealed with red wax, no seal stamp had been used. The wax had been pressed by hand. In December of that year, the city police filed a missing persons report. It included Franklin's height, weight, last known occupation, but under destination, the line was left blank. A pencil note later crossed through by the desk sergeant had once read, Said he was going west. The case lay dormant, archived and forgotten until the spring of 1873. It began with a separate investigation. Another disappearance. Another unmarried man of modest means. A detective following an unrelated trail uncovered an unclaimed box of personal effects left behind at a Manhattan boarding house. No label, no room number. No living tenant to claim it. Inside a single ring. Gold modest, but unmistakable. Etched with the phoenix crest of Franklin East. The room it came from hadn't appeared on the books in months. And the ledger, found in the same closet, half burned and filled with shorthand and partial names, would later connect 5 other men whose stories ended the same way. No witnesses ever came forward. No sightings of Franklin. No remains were recovered. No obituary was filed. Only the letter remained. And the scent on the paper, violet still refusing to fade. It was a strange advertisement, even by the eccentric standards of the Evening Telegram's back pages. A neat block of text. Bordered in faded grey ink, it appeared off and on over 3 consecutive weeks in the spring of 1871. Tucked between listings for cigar societies and piano tutors, it read, lodging available for gentlemen of considerable character. A refined 3rd-floor room, suited to a discreet bachelor of scholarly disposition. Prepaid only. Conversational company may be arranged. No women admitted. Inquire in person. 32 Mulberry Street, Upper Bell. It was signed with only one initial W. The building itself, a narrow red brick row house, bore little distinction from its neighbors. A dry goods shop occupied the ground floor, its windows dulled with yellowing lace and the oily breath of the city. The entrance to the apartments above was marked not by a name, but by a weathered bell plate stamped simply Upper Bell. A relic from when the house had briefly served as a boarding school before the war. Apartment 3R lay at the far end of the corridor, 2 narrow flights up each step, worn smooth in the center from years of repeated weight. The door bore no number, just a brass knocker. Strangely low, as if meant for someone who bowed before entering. The key arrived in a plain envelope. Red wax seal, no stamp, no initials, no instructions, only one word, yours. The first to occupy 3R under this arrangement was a man named Evan Lee, a widowed chemist from Hartford, known for quiet habits, noted for his precision. He arrived on a Tuesday with 2 trunks and a lacquered valise. He was last seen the following Saturday. His final known purchase, anchovy paste and a tin of figs, was logged at a grocer's 2 blocks west. According to sparse city inspection notes, The apartment itself measured precisely 12 feet 8 inches by 12. A single iron bedstead, a walnut desk, and a mirror. The mirror was the most unusual feature. It was large, too large for such a room, and not hung, but built into the plaster of the wall itself. Embedded, seamless. The glass was unblemished, save for one faint fingerprint in the lower right corner. It reflected the door clearly, but not the bed. That detail reflected the door, but not the bed was noted briefly by the clerk and never mentioned again. The landlady, known only as Miss W, appeared in ledgers without a full surname. Only a letter, just as in the ad. Tenants remembered her gloves always grey, and a porter once remarked that she walked like someone who had practiced it. That phrase was never explained. She didn't touch tenants. Rent was collected in sealed envelopes. Tea rations were left each month in a drawer near the entry. What distinguished 3R aside from the mirror was a single rule. It was printed discreetly on a leaflet, pasted to the inside of the wardrobe. No women permitted under any circumstance. Signed DW. Some tenants asked no questions. Their leases were renewed. Others did. Theirs were not. The few letters that did emerge from 3R were strange, reflective, detached. A shared tone of quiet transformation. I've begun to think differently here. I no longer feel crowded, but no return addresses were ever provided. One family, desperate to reply to a son's letter, received an envelope in return. Blank. Sealed in wax. Inside were only pressed violet petals. By the end of 1872, the apartment had hosted 6 known tenants. 3 were later reported missing. 2 were said to have gone west, though no passenger records could confirm it. One man's belongings were discovered at a pawn shop in Albany. His monogram had been scratched off, but the initials beneath were still faintly visible. In a city memorandum found years later among surplus housing files, an inspector had scrawled a single line across a torn maintenance slip from the Malbury address. Room unfit for women, but not for lack of hazard. Beneath it, written in a different hand, mirror fastened from the inside. In the spring of 1873, a constable named Aubrey Dean returned to Mulberry Street for what would be the third and final city-authorized inspection. He was following up on the disappearance of Dorian Bell, a young financier from Rochester. The building had yielded little. No signs of struggle, no misplaced belongings. No one answered the upper bell. But something in the room unsettled him, something that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps had always been there waiting. That morning, rain had misted the window panes. Just enough dampness to cause the floorboards to contract. And at the far edge of the bed frame, where a strip of molding had long come loose, Dean pressed his boot against a raised board. It lifted with barely a sound. Beneath it, a velvet-covered volume roughly the size of a merchant's ledger. Not calfskin but crushed plum-colored fabric, darkened near black at the edges where water had once seeped in. There was no scent of mildew, only a waxy powder clinging to the cottoned edges like dust that had not been disturbed in years. The constable set the old book on the hearthstone. He didn't speak. He simply opened the cover and began to read. For nearly an hour, the room was silent, except for the sound of crackling embers and the soft turn of yellowed pages. The entries were spare, methodical, and eerily repetitive. Each line began the same way, a name some penned in charcoal ink, others in navy or brown, followed by a date, a slanted signature, and finally, the same peculiar phrase, checked out westbound. There were 42 entries in total. Some of the names were familiar. Dorian Bell, Franklin East, Henry Stokes. Names that had once passed through the city's registries, whose faces had been printed in newspapers and pinned on bulletin boards beneath the word missing. When cross-referenced with intake logs and disappearance filings from 1870 to 1872, nearly a third of the entries matched men who had officially vanished during those years. The rest, no one had ever reported them missing. Not family, not employers, not a soul. And yet, their names had been recorded with precise uniformity. Different handwritings, yes, some elegant and practiced, others rough as if scrawled in haste. But something didn't sit right. The spacing between each line never wavered, 1 inch apart. No margin notes, no blotted corrections, no ink runs. Nothing that suggested the natural messiness of human handwriting. This prompted a quiet but growing suspicion among the investigators. Who exactly had written these names? Because it certainly wasn't the men themselves. Or if it was, it hadn't been done freely or recently. To dig deeper, the Municipal Records Bureau brought in an expert, Miss Alden, a forensic ledger analyst trained in the reconstruction of manipulated documents. Her private report, filed quietly in April of that same year, detailed 3 anomalies that still sent chills down archivists' spines. First, the ink. While the entries appeared in varied shades, sepia black blue, they all bled into the parchment at the same rate, as if written not over time but all at once. A single sitting, masquerading as decades. Second, the signatures. A dozen matched confirmed autographs from tax forms, contracts, and licenses. But each was just slightly off. A right-handed curl reversed. A surname written with unfamiliar angles. Alden wrote, "It is the signature of a man imitating himself while half asleep." And third, the most damning of all, was the phrase, "checked out westbound." Every time the same script, the same hand. Not one variation, not even a slip of punctuation. And yet, no passenger logs, no ferry tickets, no railway manifests ever recorded a single westbound departure for these men. None. The book itself bore no publisher's mark, no watermark. The pages were unlined, but ruled with mathematical perfection. 64 entries total. Its binding had no embossment, no name, no date, just a blank flyleaf, and one word penciled in the bottom right corner, mirror. Miss Alden would leave her post later that year. Her resignation letter was terse. No explanation, no farewell, just a clipped receipt for a one-way train ticket to Illinois. A train she never boarded. The book still resides in municipal storage. Its velvet cover, once deep red, was removed by a preservation clerk due to advanced fabric rot. Oddly, no record exists of who authorized the removal. When asked, the clerk could not recall making the decision, couldn't even remember submitting the form. Today, the ledger sits not in the archives of the building it was found in, nor under the names of its tenants, but rather under a special long-abandoned classification, objects of identity disruption. And years later, sometime in 1881, a final note was added to the last page, written in careful italicized script. No name, no date, just a line. They signed in as themselves. They left as no one. In the winter of 1874, long after the last tenant had vanished from 32 Mulberry Street, the building was scheduled for one final inspection, not by police, not by city officials, but by an insurance underwriter. 2 clerks were assigned to assess the structural integrity of the fire hearths. A routine matter. Ash buildup, foundation shifts, tenant alterations. But when they reached room 3R, a space left untouched for over 16 months, they encountered something off. The hearth had clearly not been used. It was clean, swept empty. But the air around it breathed cold. A soft, metallic coolness lingered just above the bricks. No other room in the building recorded the same draft. The junior clerk, a man named Adley, noticeable by the slight limp in his left foot, was the first to feel it. He knelt to measure clearance beneath the grate and tapped lightly against the panel. It sounded hollow. A seam ran along the base of the hearth, so thin, so well hidden, it would vanish if you looked at it head-on. It was only visible from the mirror. With the tip of his stylus, Adley pried the panel loose. Behind it was a shallow compartment no more than a hand's depth. Its interior was lined with soot-blackened fabric, and at its center, resting undisturbed like a keepsake from a world half-remembered, was a velvet pouch. The drawstrings were old but not tied, just looped, as though someone had meant for it to be opened. Inside were 12 pocket watches. They had been placed, delicately coiled, not tangled. Stacked carefully, none facing outward as if modesty or secrecy had shaped their arrangement. One by one, the clerks turned the watches, and each time they ticked, all 12, all in perfect unison. None had stopped. None lagged behind. Not one led the others. The official report would later call it an impossible concordance. But those who've seen the watches in person, and yes, dear viewer, there are a few surviving photographs if you know where to look, say the ticking could be felt, not just heard, like a heartbeat, like 12 men still marching somewhere far out west beneath names no one remembers, wearing faces that no longer match their own. Would you have opened the pouch? Would you have signed your name? Let us know in the comments if you dare sign in. And remember, at Sleepy History Tales, history isn't just the past, it's what waits quietly behind the panel for someone to notice the draft. Stay curious, stay cautious, and keep your watch ticking. The clerks were the first to say it aloud. Though all 12 pocket watches differed in make, origin, and the obvious signs of age, every single one marked the exact same time, down to the second. 2:17 p.m. These were not gleaming heirlooms fresh from velvet boxes. They bore years, if not decades, of handling. Tarnish dulled the silver edges of some. One had a cracked enamel face, another showed numerals nearly vanished from constant wear. Yet each watch moved, keeping time with mechanical insistence. And none, not a single one, was linked to any known living resident of 32 Mulberry, except one. Etched with care inside its lid, just above the winding stem, were the words, "Property of E. Madsen. If found, return to 48 Grammar." The inscription was neat, deliberate, untouched by corrosion. The address was real. The name matched a report of follow-up led investigators to the Madsen family, who confirmed that Edward Madsen, their eldest, had vanished 2 years prior. He had left for Manhattan on business, promised he'd write, and he had. Just once. The letter they received, brief, polite, claimed he had found respectable accommodations among the city's intellectual class. But the syntax disturbed him. Too polished. Too edited. Like a stranger mimicking his tone. The address on the watch was Edward's own. It meant he'd planned to return. He didn't. Officers returned to the building with a locksmith hoping to match a key, a room, a name. They tried the local pawn shop records. Nothing. And when handled further, the watches responded. Some ticked faster, some slowed, but all settled, eventually resetting to that same frozen hour, 2:17 p.m. Not the current time. Never the current time. But fixed perfectly so. And they would not waver again. Weeks later, a quiet insurance claim was filed by a minor office agent for damages to unregistered property. It was denied without explanation. The agent left the position 6 months later without farewell. But among the notes logged by Adley, the municipal clerk present at retrieval was one odd margin entry, easily missed unless you were searching. As he removed the final watch from its compartment, Adley felt a breeze. Just a whisper. But not from below, not from cracks in the floor. It came from across the room. The window, which had been shut tight when they arrived, now hung open barely at the latch. No one remembered unlocking it. No glass had moved audibly. Later inspection revealed no signs of forced entry, no tampering. But the metal frame had warped subtly, as if something or someone had pressed against it from within. Not once, but repeatedly. Over time, one of the clerks, unnamed, wrote something odd in the final municipal report. Just 7 words. The room is not sealed, it exhales. To this day, the watches remain in municipal custody, not listed under personal effects, not in lost property. They sit in a drawer marked simply, Articles without hour. Officers rarely open it. Fewer still speak of it. And yet, for those who have one detail, never changes. Whenever the watches are removed from their drawer, regardless of the time outside, they resume ticking, always from the same second, always from the same hour. 2:17. The letters came next. They bore no smudges, no trembling strokes. The envelopes were trimmed perfectly right angles, single crease, sealed with simple paste, not wax. Their ink, when tested, had not yet begun to crack with age. On first glance, they seemed ordinary. Notes from young men in transition, sons, cousins, fiancés, each writing from the threshold of one life, stepping into the next. There were no signs of panic, no dramatic goodbyes, no pleas, only quiet declarations. I've secured passage west to Missouri. There are opportunities I cannot ignore. The city is behind me now. I've taken up with others of sound ambition. Write me no more. Soft refusals to continue contact. Not cruel. Not even cold. Just final. At first, families accepted these letters. There was grief, of course, but no alarm. Not at first. Not until the silence lasted too long. Not until too many names faded into absence. They returned to the letters, reread them, and something shifted. The words were the same, but the weight was gone. Most noticed it first in the signature, You see, the way a person writes their name carries unconscious rhythm. The pressure of the downstroke, the slight tilt of a loop, the habitual flick of a tail on a capital G. In nearly every case, the signatures were subtly off. Not forged, not even wrong, just different. Almost as if someone had learned how to write these names perfectly. Almost, but not quite. Let's pause for a moment, dear listener. Think of a loved one's handwriting. You could spot it blindfolded, couldn't you? A birthday card, a sticky note on the fridge. The hand has weight, memory, presence. Now imagine receiving a letter that looks like theirs, sounds like theirs, but carries none of their warmth. Would you know the difference? Would you notice before it was too late? The signatures were always shaped as if drawn from memory, not from muscle, as though someone had memorized the idea of handwriting rather than experienced the act of writing itself. These weren't messages penned in haste or affection, they were echoes. Echoes of people who might no longer be there. The first person to notice anything amiss was Miss Ruth Delancey of Providence. Her brother Jonathan had taken residence at 32 Mulberry Street the previous year. One morning, Ruth received a letter claiming that Jonathan had left for Kansas City and that he'd write again should time and fortune permit. But something struck her immediately. Jonathan, she remembered clearly, had never abbreviated his name. And that J, it curled too sharply, too elegantly. It wasn't his. She brought the letter to the Boston Public Records Office, where she was directed to a handwriting clerk named Willoughby Carr. His findings were never published. Instead, his observations were discreetly sent to municipal offices in New York. On the margin of the analysis, he left a chilling note. This is not the hand of someone alive. To their own thoughts. The spacing moves like that of a copyist whose subject is drifting. More letters followed, 11 in total, each addressed to the relatives of known tenants of 32 Mulberry, each bearing a New York postmark. But not one of them was mailed from a post office near the building itself. Instead, they were dropped at satellite branches scattered across the city, some as far as 5 miles apart. Was this carelessness or careful orchestration? Each envelope bore no return address. The ink varied from charcoal to a reddish-brown rust, but in each case, the signature ended in the same way, the last letter drawn out, as if the hand had hesitated too long, and then finished quickly, as if someone else had stepped in. One such signature belonged to Emery Bell, a retired school teacher, known for his fastidious penmanship. His letter ended with a looping misstroke, an error a relative found utterly unthinkable. Emery, they recalled, once discarded a full page for a single uneven T. The postal inspector assigned to the case made a quiet but peculiar observation. While organizing the letters in storage, he noticed something oddly uniform. When stacked, the signatures on each letter aligned almost perfectly within a quarter inch of each other despite having different formatting and margins. It was subtle, too subtle to be coincidence. It was geometric, ritualistic, as if each letter had been drawn toward an invisible center rather than written naturally. At the City Records Department, an archivist named Elizabeth Grant undertook a full comparison. She laid out the 13 letters beside verified examples of each tenant's handwriting. What she discovered was not a difference in flair or evolution over time. It was something more unnerving. The letters were inverted. Loops curved the wrong way. Flourishes were restrained. Where a writer once bloomed on the page, now their lines were tight as though mimicking themselves from the outside. Elizabeth placed all 13 forgeries in a wide oak tray, side by side with authentic samples, and typed a short summary on the archival slip. They do not sign like themselves. They sign as though remembering who they were taught to be. The next morning, unprompted, she added another note. If the hand is false, the ink is not. It fades like theirs. It ages like theirs. The tray was quietly returned to the municipal archive that same week and remains there still under the file, misdirected correspondence, Mulberry case. None of the families ever received a second letter. None of the men who once lived at 32 Mulberry were heard from again. No westbound train, manifest, no ship log, no employment record, no housing lease. Nothing, but each letter ended with the same unnerving certainty. No need to reply. And at the heart of all of this, lurking just outside the ink and page, was her. She was never photographed, not in daguerreotype nor etching. Her name never appears in census logs, parish registries, or official leases. And when spoken aloud, her name was never said the same way twice. But across courtroom transcripts, city ledgers, and postmaster footnotes, she appears in pieces. They called her simply Miss W. What did the W stand for? Wallace Whitby worth no one could say for sure. Clerks who encountered her described her handwriting as deliberate, practiced, graceful, even. But when asked to say her name aloud, she would often hesitate. A notary in the 10th ward once scribbled a correction. Beside her signed lease, he had written her name, then crossed it out as though he'd forgotten something fundamental. What people remembered most wasn't her face. It was the grey skirts, grey gloves, a wool wrap the shade of stone after rain. Not a pale, fashionable grey, nor the soft silver of refined fabrics. No, hers was the color of shadow, of permanence, of being deliberately overlooked. Even her bonnet was a subdued grey trimmed with modest ribbon. Nothing ever shone. She was clean, neat, respectable, but unmemorable. One postal clerk said she reminded him of a hat stand always in the same spot, yet never quite where you last saw her. She moved with the assurance of someone who knew the building better than you did. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was refined but strangely absent of warmth. Her tone held the shape of manners, but not their spirit. She used phrases that had long fallen out of use, gracious no, or the better part of reason, and there was one final thread. A grocer on Spring Street, he said, she came in every Thursday at noon. Always bought the same items, lemon water and powdered cloves. But even her sentences, he said, felt halfway spoken, like lines rehearsed in a mirror, then altered mid-air. There were oddities, small, insistent details that never quite fit into any logical column. She wore gloves year-round, even during those suffocating August afternoons when the air itself seemed to sweat. And always the same left boot smudged, almost chalked with a pale residue. Plaster, perhaps lime dust. It clung stubbornly no matter the weather, and yet her gait was smooth, unbothered. Not a limp, not a wince. Stranger still was the object she carried every time she stepped outside a flat parcel, never large, always wrapped in plain linen. Just the size of a folio. No one saw her open it. No one saw her set it down. It existed only as an extension of her arm, like a second limb, hidden in folds of quiet routine. Then there were the papers. Applications to rent, apartment 3R, all bore her name, Miss W. But none of the signatures matched. Some curled with an elegant sweeping W. Others printed flatly, as if someone was sounding out letters for the first time. The handwriting itself never stayed still, tilted rigid sometimes, so pressed it left ghost impressions on the pages behind. A clerk in the assessor's office once commented uneasily that the ink on her leases always looked fresh even weeks after signing. Not smudged, just waiting. When asked where she lived, she offered only 32 Malbury. No floor, no suite, just the name, as though the building and she were inseparable. A cursory investigation into tax records came up short. The deed had changed hands 4 times in 4 years, but each sale came with the same peculiar clause: the 3rd floor apartment was not to be entered, not inspected, not questioned. It would remain privately administered. No one remembered her ever dining out, but deliveries came like clockwork baskets left at the rear stair. Grocers' laundries and coalmen all the same. A boy from Whitmer's laundry once remarked that her linen smelled of nothing. No starch, no sweat, no lavender, not even soap. Only dampness. And the faintest suggestion of cedar bark. A tenant named Uton Mill, a quiet bookkeeper who briefly rented to our, noted in his 1872 journal, "She smiled at me today on the stairs." Or rather, she had already begun to smile. I only passed through it. He stopped writing 2 weeks later. No final entry. City officials later admitted they could find no formal documentation under her full name. No citations, no complaints, no court orders. Everything about her emerged only indirectly: marginal notes, passing mentions in ledgers, scribbled annotations beside delivery slips. She was never summoned, never charged. And yet, she was always there. Her presence lingered in the way watermarks do, visible only when tilted at just the right angle, never head-on. One utility bill from September 1871 may hold the closest thing to a first-hand account. In the lower corner, next to a spidery Miss W, a gas company official had written. Her voice arrived before she did. Nothing else, just that. The bill was folded once and slipped under the flap of the city's duplicate ledger. Years later, during an audit, a second copy of that same receipt was discovered identical in amount, date, and name. But the signature was different. The wax seal missing. No one knew which was original, and still, Malbury Street waited. As summer thickened into something breathless and dry, number 32 stood motionless, quietly apart. The 3rd floor window, just above the dressmaker's awning, never opened. Not in spring, not in snow, not even on days when even the cobblestones steamed under the sun. The shutters stayed drawn. The curtains, heavy and opaque, hung undisturbed. No flicker of candlelight, no movement, no breath, no reflection. Across the street, a man named Avery Trent maintained a small bookbinding service from his parlor. He was meticulous, perhaps obsessively so. For over 10 years, he kept a block log, daily notes on what he observed from his window. Peddlers, stray dogs, limping horses, children's games. But one line repeats 6 times, spaced across 6 years without variation. 3rd floor Malbury. No movement, same curtains, not no resident, not empty. Just no movement. On one heavy morning in July 1871, a postal worker named Howard Gull arrived with a letter addressed in a hand. So deliberate it could have been engraved. No return address, no apartment number. Just this to the one who listens. 32 Mulberry Street, Upper Bell, 3rd floor. The envelope was thick hand-cut, sealed with a rough press of wax. No crest, no monogram, just a fingerprint smudged and human. Gull knocked once. No response. He wedged it into the door frame and continued his route. By the following morning, the letter was gone. But something else had disappeared too. At exactly 10:14 a.m., the postmaster's log records that all further mail to 32 Mulberry was marked redirected. No return, no refusal, no forwarding address, just a single red slash across each envelope and a stamped word beneath it, processed. And from that moment on, 32, Mulberry grew even quieter, but not forgotten. Never quite forgotten. This redirection did not originate from the local post station. It came without explanation from City Dispatch Central, a secure hub that at the time handled only institutional correspondence, court summonses, medical records, government alerts. There were no known channels for routing private residential mail through Dispatch Central. And yet, somehow the address at 32 Mulberry Street had been reassigned into its jurisdiction. Clerks who reviewed the routing forms years later initially found nothing amiss. But during a later attempt to digitize the records, an archivist noticed something strange. The ink used to mark the forwarding change glowed faintly under archival light. It hadn't been written with a pen at all, but applied with a linen stylus, a tool used for official state parchment, not for personal letters. And that window, it remained exactly as it always had. Inquiries from tenants in nearby buildings yielded eerily consistent responses. No one had seen the curtains move. No one recalled them being drawn, parted, or fluttered. The fabric was difficult to identify from street level, perhaps damask or something even heavier, but its color impossible to describe. Not grey, not white, just older than color. There was one exception. A chimney sweep working from the rooftop claimed he once saw light flicker behind the curtain as though it had caught its breath. He dismissed it as a trick of reflection. But when he descended the stairwell and passed the window again, he saw the latch sealed with a wedge of cloth wool, thin, deeply stained, smelling of iron and soot. Someone had intentionally sealed it shut, a carpenter hired to repair the cornice below. That same third-story sill remarked that the paint had cracked evenly, unnaturally, so as if it had aged without being touched by wind, rain, or even time. No pigeon ever landed on that sill. No claw marks, no droppings, nothing ever nested there. And when the building was finally condemned and its tenants evicted, a preservation clerk attempted to photograph the facade for archival purposes. The plate came back blank. The 3rd floor had rendered as a featureless square. No curtains, no window frame, no reflection in the glass. I focused on the curtains, he said. They were right there. I centered them, but the glass took nothing. The photo was archived under faulty exposure. Reattempt denied. But in the margin of the catalog entry, an archivist years later scribbled something barely noticeable. Window was not open. But something went through. No one knows what was in the letter addressed to the one who listens. No record survives of who sent it. But the next letter, delivered to 32 Malbury, bore a different name entirely. And the curtains, they remained just the same. His name was Arthur Bell, 28, former clerk at the Mercantile Trust Company. Unmarried, quiet, known for penciling questions in the margins of newspaper editorials, never sending letters to the editor. Only questions, always unanswered, perhaps meant to remain that way. Arthur arrived at 32 Malbury Street on October 4th, 1871. His application for tenancy was accepted within 24 hours. No references provided 2 weeks' rent paid in coin. The receipt, which still exists in the city's disputed archives, bears only one word under the balance line: settled. He took room 3R. Unlike the other lodgers, Arthur kept a log, not a diary he wrote, a record of inconsistencies. He claimed the building resisted staying fixed, that it shifted in subtle ways. At first he made notes daily, then twice a day. By his 4th week, he was writing 3 times daily. Always time-stamped, always signed with his initials, October 17th, 8:12 a.m. Desk drawer sticks differently today. Something behind it felt like a hinge, but not flush. Will not force. October 18th, 6:03 p.m. Heard knock on mirror again. Not echo. Not mistake. Tap came from behind. October 20th, 11:41 p.m. Her voice didn't pause for breath. Asked if I dream long, unsure of phrasing. She stood too far to have heard me swallow. Have you ever lived in a place that felt aware of you? Sometimes in old buildings, especially the ones no one really talks about, there are patterns. Not in the wallpaper, not in the floorboards, in the behavior of the place, in how it watches, in how it waits. Let's keep going, shall we? These final journal entries, each penned in Arthur Bell's familiar slanted hand, carry a quality both methodical and unnatural. The strokes are rigid, upright, almost mechanical, as if written by muscle memory rather than thought. The ink tells its own story. Earlier entries are marked in bold black, later ones in a fading iron brown. The last pages are written in a diluted blue-black that bleeds and streaks across the parchment as though the pen had been dragged underwater or across a page not yet dry. It was this journal that would later be discovered crumpled and waterlogged in the laundry chute of the building. Folded in on itself, spine cracked violently backward, it appeared to have suffered a fall. But there was a problem, one that never made it into the official reports. The blueprints for the building submitted to the housing office in 1869 make no mention of a laundry chute. None was ever located during demolition. And yet, there it was. The entry believed to be his last is dated October 22nd, 4th, 19 a.m. It reads, "Room is wrong shape today. Door further from desk. Mirror shows lamp on before I lit it. Tried to measure distance to wall. Ran out of thread. Cannot find spool. The line ends there. Mid-sentence." Below the words, faint but unmistakable, is a scattering of vertical lines drawn freehand, uneven in length. Some halt halfway down the page, others run to the edge. Are they tallies? Are they structural sketches? No one could say, and no one came looking for Arthur Bell. No formal inquiry followed his disappearance. His employer presumed he had fled to escape his debts. His estranged family never filed a report. The landlord at 32 Malbury Street didn't even note his absence. but his trunk remained in room 3R, sealed unclaimed, still labeled AB, room 3R. Inside, 2 crumpled dress shirts, 2 pairs of fine gloves, and a length of black thread measured precisely at 7 feet 11 inches. Tied at one end was a copper button of the kind used on naval coats. Arthur Bell had no known military record. None of his garments bore such a fastener. No one ever came to collect his belongings. The trunk was eventually placed in storage beneath the staircase. A year later, during a routine inventory, it was found open, its contents neatly rearranged. But something had been added, a single folded slip of paper, pinned beneath the gloves. The handwriting didn't match Bell's. There was no greeting, no name, only a question. Did he dream long enough? That scrap of paper still exists. It's catalogued under supplemental tenant materials in the Malbury file. No fingerprints, no date, no origin. Just the question and the thread. Still tied, still measured, still waiting to be followed. In another part of the city, the account ledgers of the Fifth Bank of Manhattan were kept inside a brick-lined, windowless annex behind 2 iron doors that required dual-key access. The ledgers were thick, handwritten in carbon ink, countersigned in red pencil, by clerks who took pride in the elegance of their penmanship. As the head cashier once described it, a temple of exactitudes. But even temples crack. It was during a routine audit in November 1873 that something delicate and disturbing emerged in ledger number 17. Amid pages of routine deposits from attorneys, shopkeepers, and tradesmen appeared a sequence of names. Familiar names: Dorian Bell, Edward Matson, Franklin East, Emery Hollow, Arthur B. Men who had all vanished from the very same building, 32 Malbury Street. One by one, their names resurfaced. Not in obituaries, not in wills, but on deposit slips. The timing was unnerving. Each deposit was made exactly 11 to 17 days after the man's disappearance. The sums were consistent, always between 24 and 28. Not a cent more, not a cent less. Enough to imply a pattern too little to trigger scrutiny. These were not wages, not estate settlements, just personal lodgements, all in cash, all bearing only the depositor's name and the initials of the bank teller. And then, silence. Each account would sit dormant for days, sometimes weeks, before being drained entirely. No checks, no withdrawal slips, no co-signers, only a handwritten bank draft, always in the same uneven scrawl. When the original signatures were reviewed and compared to verified samples, business letters, contracts, legal documents, the inconsistencies were immediate. The curves were wrong, the pressure uneven. Some of the signatures faded unnaturally, drifting off the page with no anchor, like someone imitating the gesture of handwriting, without understanding how to wield a pen. Some believed it was fraud, others thought it ritual, and maybe, dear listener, maybe it was both. What would you do standing in front of that vault, staring down a pattern so precise it felt choreographed? A name, a number, a silence, and then disappearance. Whatever happened at 32 Malbury Street didn't end in that room. It echoed outward into ledgers, into thread, into silence, into you now listening. Would you have followed the thread? The forensic clerk tasked with analyzing the handwriting included a discreet note. in the margins of the final report. They do not fail to match the note read, they avoid it. The implication was clear. These signatures weren't mismatched by accident. They were intentionally distorted, not forged exactly, but twisted. Like someone trying to recreate a face they'd only seen once long ago and never up close. Then there were the teller logs. Protocol at the time required 2 staff members to verify all high-value drafts. And yet, the initials on the documents were anything but consistent. Some signatures were barely there, faint traces that could vanish with a smudge. Others were pressed with such force they punctured the paper engraved rather than written. The teller named most frequently in these transactions was Mr. James Cullen, who had been quietly dismissed earlier that year. Officially, the reason was emotional instability. But curiously, no dismissal paperwork was ever filed, no record of severance. When investigators tracked his last known address to a boarding house on 14th Street, they found he'd vanished 4 months earlier. His room was cleared, belongings boxed, among them a single envelope unmarked except for a penciled note scrawled onto its interior flap. They kept coming back to sign. Same quote. Same silence. Always knew the amount. That sentence, half diary, half confession, was never meant for official eyes. And yet, it explained what no logbook ever did. Cullen had been issuing drafts without identification, again and again, despite strict policy, despite knowing it was wrong. The assumption at the time was that these were discreet arrangements between gentlemen, unspoken, unrecorded, handled in quiet. But no fee was charged, no receipts forwarded, no notes of explanation. Just names. Names that over time had become a kind of currency. In the ledger beside Franklin East's final recorded draft, a faint red line crosses through the sum of 2615. Just below it, final M accepted. The handwriting matches no known employee on duty that day. And unlike every other margin note, it wasn't written in pencil. It was ink and permanent. One investigator later remarked that by then these ledgers weren't bookkeeping anymore. They were something else entirely, testimonies, not of spending but of inertia. And while the names remain inked in the ledger to this day, the account numbers tied to them have long since been reassigned, all but one. The account once held under the name Bell was emptied in full but never reassigned. Its number 4207 was quietly retired. When the bank merged with a larger firm in 1903, a final line was added to its permanent record. Do not assign. This number already withdrew itself. Strange, isn't it? The order to investigate 32 Mulberry Street came not from City Hall nor from the Metropolitan Police, but from the Controller's Office. An internal directive, quiet, unpublicized, filed under tax irregularities and unregistered structural changes. But the 4 plainclothes officers dispatched in the late spring of 1873 understood otherwise. They came just before dusk, not with warrants, but with ledgers and silence. The building was nearly vacant. Only a single tenant remained, an elderly milliner on the 2nd floor who refused to answer the door, though her voice could be faintly heard, humming behind it. Something old, something circular. The officers climbed in silence, their boots creaking against each riser, the staircase moaning, like it remembered things it could no longer speak aloud. Room 3R was locked, not bolted. A skeleton key opened it easily. Inside, 12 feet square. A walnut desk, iron bedstead, mirror set into cracked plaster. Dust thick on every surface but undisturbed. It hadn't been cleaned, but neither had it been touched. Yet there was warmth. Not heat exactly, but the suggestion of breath that had only recently left. As if someone had just slipped out a minute before they arrived. It was Officer Whitley, the youngest of the four, a clerk's son, who noticed the window. Unlike the others in the building clouded with city soot and coastal grime, this pane had been cleaned, wiped with unnatural precision. It caught the failing daylight, not with haze, but with a strange, sharpened clarity. The kind that forces you to look closer. Etched into the bottom right corner of the glass, barely an inch above the sill, were 5 words, "Don't believe where you are." The lettering was not rushed, each stroke deliberate, the serifs too consistent to be chance. But most disturbing was the direction. The message was reversed. Legible only from the inside of the room, as though someone had stood in the space and carved it, while facing out, meant for someone looking inward. And yet, the outer glass showed no mark, no scratches, no blemish, no residue. The message had been etched on the inside surface of a window that by all records had not been opened in years. There was no engraving tool, no acid, no powdered glass, nothing, just a phrase, suspended there in silent warning. The officers transcribed it into their ledgers, and then, beneath the bed, they found a pencil, short, dulled, used nearly to its midpoint. Its eraser was untouched. The pencil bore the initials AB faintly scorched into its lacquered side. Investigators assumed it had belonged to Arthur Bell, the missing tenant who, according to the landlord, had kept an obsessively detailed log of his daily routine. No journal was recovered this time, but wedged behind the lower bureau drawer, folded tightly and hidden against the wood grain, they discovered a coiled strip of linen binding tape, dusty creased and mottled with faint stains of something chalky and dark. Barely visible, a shadowed impression had transferred itself onto the tape's surface. Not ink, not dye, just the ghost of pressure from whatever surface it had once pressed against. At the precinct, a junior archivist attempted to document the markings. Under standard lighting, the tape remained frustratingly blank. But when a red archival filter was applied, a technique reserved for revealing faded writing, the phrase didn't appear as text at all. It surfaced instead as a negative indentation, something pressed into being rather than written. And the words, once enhanced, diverged subtly from the initial report. They now read, "Don't believe where you are." The shift, a pronoun, went unnoticed in the first inspection. It was only later, when the archivist circled the phrase in the margin of his report, that he noted something unsettling. The phrasing implies a speaker. The direction implies a listener who remains. Following the inspection, city records show the apartment was sealed. Officially, at least. But in 1875, a maintenance worker was found unconscious just outside the door, his ring of skeleton keys still clutched in one hand. When revived, he insisted he had never entered, hadn't even touched the lock, just passed by. His only recorded statement given to the attending nurse was this: "I saw the mirror blink." No elaboration, no charges filed. The door was padlocked. Again, 6 years later in 1881, a glazier repairing a window on the third floor of the adjacent building described something strange. While adjusting the sash from outside, he claimed to see words faint floating backward on the pane opposite him in the next building. A warning, he thought. Or maybe a reply. He couldn't read the full message. But what he could read unnerved him enough that he left before finishing the job. He never returned. The original window, removed but never shattered, now sits in city storage. Beneath sunlight, it appears unremarkable. But when held against a darkened wall, the lettering re-emerges, always reversed. Always waiting to be read from within. A faded blueprint dated to 1869 renders the third floor of 32 Mulberry Street plainly. 2 rooms, mirror images, each 11 by 10 feet, separated by a single wall. Room 3L facing the alley. Room 3R facing the street, no closets, no corridor, no auxiliary spaces, just 2 rectangles. And yet, between January 1870 and September 1873, 11 separate leases were signed for Room 3R. The signatures are still legible. East Bell Hollow, Matson, Carr, Whitby, and 5 more names lost to archive water damage. Each lease bears distinct handwriting, different payment records, but every single one references the same room. A room that by the building's plans could not have housed them all, not in time, not in sequence. The irregularity might have gone unnoticed if not for a complaint filed in the summer of 1872 by a tenant on the second floor. She reported a stain, at first small, then abruptly blooming, spreading above her bed. After 2 ignored reports, a plumber was finally dispatched. His name was Reuben Leol, an older man familiar with the building's early piping. He arrived with a lantern, a rusted wrench set, and a small graphite notebook used for sketching pipework when the layout didn't make sense on paper. What he found, he later told investigators, made no sense at all. There was no leak, no corrosion, no pressure loss. Just a faint sound like fabric being brushed coming from behind the north wall of room 3R. Thin, distant. Not dripping, not mechanical. Moving. Still, Lyall opened the wall. 2 lath panels near the ceiling were removed, revealing a narrow void, less than a foot wide, sealed on either side by brick. No vent, no utility run. Just a sliver of space. Inside, coiled and dry, was a single length of rope. Not wire, not linen. Twisted twine looped once at the end, untorn, still warm. When asked why he never filed a report on the rope, Lyall admitted he'd mentioned it verbally to the landlady. Described her as grey-gloved chin held high. Claimed she seemed aware. She thanked him, paid in coin, and that was the end of it. When pressed by the city board, Lyall added something that never made it into the official transcript. But in the court reporter's shorthand, scribbled faintly in the margin, it reads, "Felt like I was being watched, but I was alone." City officials contacted the building's original contractor the following spring during a fire safety audit. Harold Stoughton and Sons had built the place in 1869. Harold had since retired, but his son, now foreman, dug up the old blueprints. He confirmed the design. Only 2 rooms were framed and completed. No expansions, no secret partitions, no crawl spaces. Yet, in the 1871 census, 3 third-floor residents are listed, and in the 1872 fire insurance survey, scrawled faintly in graphite in the bottom margin, never officially filed, is this line: third room not drawn, no chimney present, still warm. The note caught the attention of a clerical apprentice named Judith Hill, who requested access to conduct a spatial survey. Her measurements returned something mathematically impossible. The hallway outside room 3R was 31 inches shorter than its counterpart on the second floor. Identical blueprints, identical outer walls. When she returned to remeasure the next day, the difference had increased to 33 inches. Hill never filed her final report. 6 weeks later, she resigned from the Office of Tenancy and declined all follow-up correspondence. What she saw or what saw her remains unknown. But in the city's sealed archive under a restricted file code stamped 1873 A3R, there is a single note clipped to the folder. 4 words, handwritten in red ink. It's not a room. The last official tenant assigned to room 3R at 32 Mulberry Street was Thomas S. Marlin, a telegraph operator from Schenectady. His lease, dated May 9, 1873, contains no forwarding address. His name vanishes from public record after that date. But his original rental application, still held in municipal archives, includes a peculiar notation next to the room number: requested rear-facing view. Assigned front. Beneath that, barely legible beneath a faint erasure, a second line reads, room felt wrong. Door wouldn't stay aligned. Mirror showed hallway, even with door shut. The handwriting does not match Marlin's. Stranger still, the application is signed twice, once in black ink, once in graphite. The name is spelled identically, but the penmanship differs as if written by 2 different people. The census of 1870 was intended as a routine bureaucratic sweep. Just names, ages, occupations and places of birth meant to keep pace with a city expanding faster than its ledgers could manage. Enumerators carried dull pencils, carbon-copied forms, stamps and stiff brushes to flatten sheets on rain-slicked stoops. In most districts, the numbers balanced. In a few, they didn't. But only one address drew attention from the municipal registrar's office, not for what it included, but for what it had erased. Mulberry Street appears plainly in the master index for the 12th ward. The building number is listed. The structure, a 3-story dwelling wood over brick, is logged as multi-unit. But beneath the section labeled occupants by floor, the 3rd floor residence is blank. Not vacant, just blank. A single red dash floats centered across the line. No names, no occupations, no notations of under renovation or temporarily closed. No strike-throughs, no margin notes. The original block sheet Form 11G was signed in July by 2 enumerators, Martin Heller and Frederick Dial, and was marked as completed in full. Both later submitted sworn affidavits attesting they had indeed recorded 3 residents on the 3rd floor of 32 Mulberry, 2 male tenants and a 3rd individual they could not identify. Possibly a guest, possibly a servant. Dial wrote in a follow-up memo. Names were entered, signatures intact, professions listed. But when the bound census volumes were finalized for public archives in 1871, sheet number 493, Heller and Dial's original was gone. In its place was a replacement form, neatly copied in a different hand. The address data remained identical for the entire block, except for one. 32 Mulberry now showed only 2 floors occupied. The third floor section was empty. The red dash was still present, but now drawn in ink. At the bottom of the page, a small printed notation read, "Redrafted due to damage. Original sheet 493 compromised by rain. Clerk copy filed in substitution." But something about the signature stood out. Hela's name was there but off. The downstroke of the H curled to the left, not the right. His usual underlined tail was absent. When questioned, Hela simply said, "I recopied the form only once. No one asked me to." Dial, however, was less sure. In a letter to the Census Review Board, dated March 4th, 1872, he wrote, "I recall redrafting forms for Canal and Dansansi. I do not recall touching Malbury. If the sheet was changed, it wasn't by my hand." Dial died 2 months later of apoplexy. The letter was archived and forgotten. That same year, a junior archivist tasked with cataloguing census discrepancies for the Historical Commission discovered the replacement sheet had been folded incorrectly into the census book. It hadn't been sewn into the spine, just tucked. Behind it, hidden between pages, was a torn slip of paper roughly the size of a tenant form. It was unsigned, but it bore a single sentence written in firm block letters. The census counted walls, not people. The paper was never added to the official record. Instead, it was taped inside the cover of the census book, quietly passed from archivist to archivist. Some regarded it as a cryptic joke. Others saw it as a placeholder for something that had quietly disappeared. But the handwriting didn't match Hela's or Dial's or any known city employee from the time. In 1876, the New York Historical Society requested to photograph the original entries for the Malbury district. When the volume was opened, the replacement sheet was missing. In its place, a new copy, neatly transcribed, folded properly, bound with linen thread. Again, the third floor entries were gone, but this time even the red dash had been removed. Only a stark white void remained. In the margin beside 32 Malbury, a tiny numeral had been penciled in barely visible along the edge of the page, 1H. There was no apartment 1H. No city map showed such a designation. Yet, one former census clerk interviewed decades later recalled a rumor whispered to new enumerators, just strange enough to stick in memory. They said some rooms didn't give names. They gave answers. The drawer was found by accident. It wasn't part of the building's official storage. No blueprint recorded its location. No ledger included its dimensions. It was discovered behind a warped wooden panel in the basement of 32 Malbury Street, flush against the foundation where the plaster never fully dried. A janitor named Winslow, assigned to clear debris before demolition, had pulled the panel loose to sweep behind a rusted water tank. What he found didn't match any inventory ever submitted to the city. The drawer didn't creak. It didn't catch. It slid open with a smoothness that felt intentional, like it had been waiting for someone who knew not to hesitate. Inside were 12 tintypes, arranged in a perfect grid, each photograph nestled between slips of soft worn grey cloth. Every tintype measured precisely 2 by 3 inches, sepia-toned, printed on thin black lacquered iron and smoothed at the edges by frequent handling. No dates, no studio insignias. And yet, beneath each portrait, a single name etched in narrow script directly into the plate. Just first names: Emery, Franklin, Dorian, Elias. Arthur, Thomas, and 6 others labeled in the same quiet hand. The ink had faded, but remained intact. A clerk from the city archives, summoned by the trustees of the condemned property, remarked that the handwriting resembled an old parchment script, a style no longer taught after 1861. Each name had been incised with a steel stylus, then inked in by hand. A delicate, deliberate act. The men in the photographs were well-dressed, though not extravagant. Frock coats, starched collars, pocket watches, gloves. Their expressions varied, some on the verge of a smile, others tense, but all gazed straight into the lens. Their eyes met the camera with unnerving focus. None appeared distressed, and yet none had the ease of someone who posed by choice. On plate, labeled simply, Arthur had 2 fine vertical scratches running down the eyes, light enough not to damage the iron, but deep enough to darken the irises, as if someone had tried to erase his gaze without touching the rest of the face. When these tintypes were shown to surviving relatives of the tenants once reported missing from the building, no one could confirm any identity. "It could be him," said Ruth Delancey, sister of Jonathan Delancey. "But the eyes aren't his. They're still waiting for something." That quote was added in the margins of the archivist's final report. Each tintype had been laid atop a piece of linen, pressed flat, preserved as if in preparation for cataloguing. But under the cloth lining, investigators found something else, a thin, greasy residue. Odorless, slightly tacky to the touch. Tests at the time were inconclusive. Modern analysis suggests it might have been a crude fixative or polish commonly used in low-cost photography studios. But no such studio was ever registered in the area. No negatives were ever found. The drawer itself was modest, just over 3 feet across, shallow, unpainted and unfinished. Its back panel bore faint scorch marks. Not burn marks, there was no charring. Just the suggestion that heat had once passed through the drawer from behind. Initial theories assumed the drawer had been near a furnace at some point. But the building's furnace rusted, and long dormant, showed no matching burns. The wall behind the drawer was brick dry and completely intact. The photographs were removed, examined, and eventually sealed in a box now housed at the Metropolitan Archive. Their official catalogue title, Unnamed Male Subjects Malbury Drawer. A misleading title. They weren't unnamed, just incomplete. In 1973, during a routine digitization project, an imaging technician noticed something strange. When scanned under a low red spectrum light, each of the tintypes revealed a faint second layer of etching beneath the names. The hidden lines ran vertically invisible under normal lighting. The letters were near microscopic, and every plate carried the exact same phrase. Lodged, not placed. Same spacing. Same stylus pressure. All 12. The technician filed a report. No investigation followed, but the file remains in the archive. Incomplete, because one of the plates, catalogued as Elias, refused to scan. Not because of surface damage. The scanner couldn't register the image at all. Multiple machines failed. Replacement equipment was brought in. Settings were changed. The final scan attempt returned only metadata. No image, just a status line. Subject Elias. Location 32 Malbury, Drawer 1. Status lodged. Scan result photograph already taken. No further scans were attempted. Elias was returned to the drawer, but once the drawer was slid back into place, it no longer fit. It was now 1 inch too wide for the cavity it had once sat in for decades. It began again with a note. Not a complaint, not even an official report, just a folded scrap of paper, unsigned, left with the desk sergeant at the 4th precinct. The message read, "She goes out, but no one sees her return. Always grey, always gloves. She buys poison by the dram." Beneath that, an address written in elegant cursive, 32 Mulberry. No name attached. Constable Elias Brown was assigned the matter. Not because of merit, but because Elias Brown was forgettable. 21 years in uniform, walking corners, watching windows. He had the quiet presence that drew no notice. Exactly the kind of man you'd send to listen, not be seen. The woman was spotted again at the corner of Mulberry and 23rd. Grey skirts, long gloves, a soft parcel beneath one arm. She stepped into a narrow apothecary tucked beside a butcher's stall. The bell above the shop door chimed once. Brown, watching from across the street, adjusted his cap and followed, careful not to move too quickly. Inside, the clerk remembered her well. She had asked for belladonna tincture. Not for sleep, for clarity, she said. She claimed she measured dreams in drops. Her voice was soft, deliberate, like someone who had practiced conversation not for charm, but for control. When the clerk asked for a name to enter into the apothecary's restricted ledger, she handed him a calling card, cream-colored, unembossed. No name, no occupation, just a single line of indigo ink, centered perfectly. 3R. The clerk placed the card beneath a ledger, wait, turned to fetch the vial, and when he turned back, she was gone. Brown, only 20 paces from the doorway, swore he had seen her exit. She stepped lightly from the shop, gloved hand, clutching the parcel. She passed the alleyway between the apothecary and the barber shop, turned the corner, and vanished. He followed. The alley was short, damp brick walls still slick from last night's rain. But she was no longer there. There was no door, no carriage, no woman. The constable's report filed the next morning was brief. Individual not found. Pursued directly. No visual obstruction. Vanished at corner. There were no further notes. No recommendations. 2 weeks later, a boy sweeping the stoop of the same apothecary found something curious. A scrap of paper folded tightly into the lower railing. Torn from a larger sheet, one edge bore the faint imprint of a missing calling card. The note read, "Used too much. Spoke too clearly. 3R repeats itself now." It was unsigned. The handwriting was thin and upright, with slight pauses before each capital letter, as though the writer had to remember what shape words were supposed to take. The boy gave it to the clerk, who placed it beside the ledger folded twice. By morning it was gone. When the precinct reviewed the apothecary's log to trace a purchase of belladonna, they found the ledger intact. But the page for that date had been replaced. The handwriting and ink matched, but one line was missing. Where it once read, "Female, tall, grey coat." 3 Belladonna, it now said, "Only entry pending. Name unknown." In the margin, in nearly invisible pencil, someone had written, "Second time for this one." Constable Brown, who had initially followed the woman, was reassigned later that year. He requested a quieter beat farther north. When asked why, he gave no explanation. But in his final logbook, dated December 1871, between meal receipts and patrol notes, he had scribbled a single line, "Saw her again, not walking, just present." Like a photograph that hadn't finished developing. There is no record of the woman ever being detained, questioned, or even named. But in the municipal records office, under a folder marked "Anomalous Correspondence Lower Wards," a single calling card remains. Blank, clean. It still smells faintly of ink. In May of 1873, an order was issued, demolish 32 Mulberry. The decision was procedural, uncontested. The structure had failed inspection for the third time in 4 years. The foundation was compromised, its tax ledger unbalanced. 2 tenants had disappeared mid-lease. A third attempted to claim ownership of a room that didn't exist in official plans. The city condemned it. Demolition was scheduled to take 4 days, but room 3R wouldn't come down. The municipal work crew began on a Monday. They were instructed to proceed top-down frame to joist wall to stud. The southern corner room 3R was first on the list. They tore down plaster, pulled lath from beams. By morning, it had all returned, not rebuilt, not rejoined, restored. Same seams, same cracks, same faded marks near the window frame. One carpenter, Dunleavy, marked the wall with his initials in pencil before leaving. When he returned the next day, the wall was back. So were his initials. The foreman accused the crew of abandoning the task. But one man, a newcomer from the Pennsylvania mines, refused to re-enter the room. "We take down brick," he said. "But it doesn't stay gone. It waits, like it already knows the shape it's meant to hold." On Thursday, a city inspector was called. The room was cold, dry. Dust lined the sill in perfect stillness. He walked the perimeter 4 paces by 3. The air felt thin, drawn from somewhere else. He tapped the mirror. Solid. Tapped again and heard a hollow sound behind the wall. Reaching into his satchel, he pulled out the lease register and found a page he hadn't packed. A blank lease unsigned at the top, dated 2 days prior. At the bottom, in fresh, dark blue ink, East F. The ink hadn't even dried. He filed his report under protest, requesting the room be sealed, not demolished. But there was no owner to contact. The landlady, Miss W. Long, had never filed deed or lease. The property was unclaimed in the city registry. On Friday, a second crew returned. They tried to cut through the floor from below, but the saw blade snapped. The space above wasn't empty, but it wasn't recognizable either. No dust, no detail. A boy sent to inspect refused to enter. "It doesn't match the rest," he said. "The door's on the wrong side inside." His phrasing made the final report. That same day, a clerk reviewing demolition paperwork found a conflict. The occupancy log for 1873 listed room 3R as vacant, but the day's expense ledger recorded a rent payment $26 in person, filed under the name F. East. Same handwriting, same ink. The signature didn't match any census record from 1871, but it matched a letter received in Boston in 1870. A letter long believed to be a forgery, signed by a man who had vanished. In 1874, demolition resumed. The instruction removed the structure but preserve room 3R for separate evaluation. But when they returned, the room had changed. First measured at 6 ft by 10, then 4 by 12, then square again. It was shifting measurably as though remembering a different shape it had once held. The final note in the building's ledger came from an assistant surveyor named Colby. She stepped briefly inside to measure the space and found a new document on the desk. A blank lease, unsigned. Except for the final line, "I have accepted the room. Let me remain." The handwriting was hers. She had never written it. The demolition was stopped. The building was braced with steel sealed in brick. Room 3R was left untouched, unlisted, forgotten on paper at least. Today there is no 32 Malbury, no plaque, no stairwell, no door. But if you pass by at the right hour, just before the final post arrives, you may still see an envelope resting in the frame. No stamp, no return address, only a name in blue ink. For the next who signs. The boarding house came down in pieces, but room 3R was never flattened. It simply receded. The mirror is gone, the walls unmounted. But every few years, the city receives another misfiled envelope. Blank, dated, signed with a name once used by someone who disappeared. If you've made it this far, pause. Look around. Tell me where you are. And the time. Because someone somewhere may still be listening through the glass. And every signature needs a witness. This is the 7th mark. And this was the story of the apartment for gentlemen only.